Affordable rent is becoming increasingly scarce in Nova Scotia. More than 100 weapons are seized from a home in Gatineau. Pro-Palestine protesters successfully disrupt Trudeau meeting with Italian Prime Minister. Iranian singer behind protest anthem sentenced to 3 years amid elections. And reports of 170 people executed in Burkina Faso. Good morning. It's Monday, March 4th. I'm Nora. Here are your headlines. We start today in Nova Scotia, where, like the rest of the country, affordable housing is becoming increasingly scarce. In this case, fixed-term leases are what's allowing landlords to screw over tenants. The province does have a rent cap for existing tenants, and it announced that earlier this year it was going to be increasing by 5% in June, up from 2%. But landlords have been using fixed-term leases to get around the rent cap. It allows them to set a lease with a deadline that they can then refuse to renew. The result has been tenants who've been paying relatively affordable prices for rent are then kicked out so that landlords can jack the prices. And this has been happening to entire buildings, eating up the available stock of affordable housing. Speaking to CBC, Matthew Hayes, a sociology professor at St. Thomas University in Fredericton, said that between 2016 and 2021, Halifax saw a 25% reduction in housing units available for less than $1,000 a month. And according to the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, this past fall, the province had the highest rate of rental inflation in the whole country, while Halifax's average rent had its largest jump since data started being recorded in the 1980s. A spokesperson with the Department of Service in Nova Scotia told CBC that the province is aware that landlords are using fixed-term leases to get around the rent cap and that it is, quote, working to find ways to address both landlords' rising expenses and tenants' need for rent stability to reduce the incentive for landlords to use fixed-term leases. Next, the Canadian press is reporting that Canada Border Services Agency and local police have seized over 100 weapons from a single home in Gatineau. This follows an investigation launched by the Border Services Agency in November of last year. A silencer was found in a courier package at Toronto Pearson Airport that was traced back to a Gatineau residence. That person had prohibited weapons seized from him before. Executing a warrant in early February, police say they found this: 61 firearms, 13 prohibited weapons, 22 air guns, 12 prohibited devices, 6 silencers, and 6 high-capacity magazines, ammunition, shipping documents, and packaging for silencers, and 5 electronic devices. Now, this is according to City News. The 62-year-old resident was arrested, but police have yet to lay charges, nor did they name him. It's so interesting how different people are treated by the law when they have a giant weapons cache or when they're, vandalizing an Indigo store in downtown Toronto. And speaking to that, next, pro-Palestinian activists successfully disrupted an event between Justin Trudeau and Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. The event was meant to take place at the Art Gallery of Ontario to cap off a day of meetings between the two leaders. But protesters were able to block off all the entrances to the gallery, preventing attendees from entering the building and forcing the event to be cancelled. Neither of the two leaders was even able to make it to the event. Protesters were also able to prevent International Development Minister Ahmed Hussein from entering the building. His office is behind the decision to suspend Canada's funding to UNRWA, which is a humanitarian lifeline for people in Gaza. Hussein's decision came after Israel accused 12 of the agency's employees of being involved in the October 7th attacks, allegations that Israel has not provided any evidence at all for. Toronto police, who've been regularly targeting pro-Palestinian protesters, are saying that they are looking into the protests at the gallery and, quote, if it's determined that illegal activity occurred, charges can be laid at a later date, unquote. Now, we have to be very, very clear here. Meloni is a fascist, or her party has fascist roots. She has been in fascist clubs, and she's never disavowed former stances that she's taken. Many of her acolytes are open fans of Mussolini. And so it was wild to see politicians of all stripes condemning the action, most of them calling it anti-Semitic for some reason. That's a real head scratcher. Sure, there were Palestinian flags present, as both Canada and Italy have been supporting Israel, but it's a fascinating trick people like Marco Mendicino are playing here. To say that blocking access to an event with a fascist is anti-Semitic turns everything about reality up on its head. Luckily, judging by the reactions on social media, most people were not buying it. Next to international news. First, an Iranian pop singer whose song became a protest anthem has been sentenced to at least 3 years in prison for, quote, inciting and provoking people to riot to disturb national security, unquote. 26-year-old Shervin Hajipour wrote a song during the mass protests that shook Iran after Mahsa Amini died in police custody in 2022. Amini had been arrested for allegedly violating Iran's mandatory hijab laws. The singer posted the news on his Instagram account, but it's not clear when the verdict was issued, and Iranian state media has not reported on the story. Hajipour's post came on the same day that Iran was holding its parliamentary elections, the first elections since protests erupted in 2022. Violent suppression of the 2022 protests, political corruption, and a stagnating economy have led to historically low voter turnout at the elections. And finally, to Burkina Faso, or back to Burkina Faso, where violence by armed groups continues to terrorize the people there. According to a regional prosecutor, 120 people were executed in attacks on villages in the north of the country. You'll remember that this comes after an attack on a church killed 15 people last week in the north of the country, and in the east, some number of people were killed at a mosque. Survivors of this most recent and separate attack say that most of the people who were killed were women and children. Burkina Faso has been subject to repeated attacks by armed groups who control half of the country. According to a reporter who spoke to Al Jazeera, the attack was likely an attempt by armed groups to demonstrate their relevance to the country after being targeted by the military with airstrikes. A group that tracks data in areas ravaged by armed conflict says that 439 people were killed in Burkina Faso as a result of this violence in January alone. Those are your headlines for Monday, March 4th. I'm Nora. You're listening to this podcast at sandynora.com, on the Real News Network podcast feed, and anywhere you get your podcasts. If you're starting March break like I am, I hope you have a wonderful time, and I will talk to you tomorrow.